So I will walk you through basically the topic that I've been studying for my MBA program, which is introverted leadership. And I will break that down into three pieces. First of all, I will tell a little bit more about personality. We're going to make a brief walk through psychology, history, looking at several important people who have actually studied the topic of personality. Then after that, I'm going to link personality to leadership. And I finish off with a short note on neurodiversity because introversion is actually part of that. So if we start with the topic of personality, well, I really dove into that topic for my own thesis and then also the book. And I discovered that there's a lot of research that has been done on this topic, even though psychology is something that's only 100 years old. But still, there have been so many people looking into this topic. The first one, you may be familiar with him, Carl Gustav Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and about 100 years ago, he was one of the first people who studied personality. And he did that by observing people. He would just be with them all day, look at what they were doing. He would do some introspection because, well, he was actually linked to Freud, and Freud also did it that way. But in the end, Jung decided to do it slightly differently. So he didn't agree totally with Freud in the end. He created his own movement, so to say. And Jung was actually the first one to discover the difference between introversion and extroversion. And he defined it as a difference in orientation between people. Because, well, as you see it here, introverts, they have a subjective orientation on the outside world. And what that means in normal language is that for introverts, the inner world is their starting point. That is where they get their energy from. That is where they return when they lack energy. Whereas for extroverts, it's the other way around. They get energy from their environment, from people around them. And being alone, it actually drains them to do that. Then maybe you might know these ladies as well. Myers and Briggs, a mother and a daughter from the US. They were very interested in the work of Jung. So they actually took that as a starting point in order to develop the first instrument in order to measure personality. They added some extra dimensions that you see here. So not only extroversion and introversion, but also sensing or intuition, whether or not you're a more intuitive person, thinking and feeling, well, that one's pretty straightforward. And then perceiving and judging, which is about whether or not you are organized as a person. And if you combine all of these different letters, then you get to 16 different types. And this instrument is still used today. There are some other forms with all of the colors, like the disc ones, or a lot of several similar things that you can use in order to measure it. So it's really something that is still alive today. However, it is not really scientifically valid because I also spoke to several professors at university here in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and they told me, yeah, it's interesting, the stuff from Jung and Myers and Briggs, but it is not replicable. You cannot like do it again and get the same result over and over again, which doesn't make it really valid. So it's interesting, but you should not see it as something more than just a simple horoscope. This man you see over here, and a lot of people don't know him, he is actually the one who started with studying personality in a more scientific way. He did that by taking a dictionary and he would look for adjectives describing people. And well, he found almost 18,000, as you see over here. And then he was looking for correlations between those adjectives. Like, are there groups of adjectives that we can use in order to describe people? And by doing that, he brought it down to 16 different traits of personality, introversion being one of them, where on the one end of the spectrum, well, he described it as being open, being friendly, and the other side as being more private and more quiet. So that's already a little bit more as we describe it today. And that was actually the basis for, I think, one of the most important scientifically valid instruments, the Big Five, which measures 5 dimensions of personality, also extroversion being one of that. Then agreeableness, neuroticism or emotional stability, conscientiousness, that's the one about being organized or not, and openness. In openness, there's creativity, openness to new experiences, for example. And then the last, more recent research into the topic of personality is done by the Neuroscience, because what they did is actually scan brains of people who scored more on the introverted side and the extroverted side of the spectrum. And then they found that there's a difference when it comes to dopamine receptors. And dopamine is the happiness hormone that we all need as human beings. But what they found is that people who are more introverted, they need less of it. They have lesser receptors in their brain, whereas extroverts, they need more of it. And what dopamine, actually, the need for dopamine does is that it makes you go out, makes you connect. So that is what explains why introverts don't feel the urge to get out there as much as extroverts do. It's actually a basic need that is different between the two. So that's another way to look at it, and I think a very interesting one, because it shows that it's also in the brain, which makes it part of diversity, right? So I went through all of that, but because I also spoke to about 400 people worldwide who were self-declared introverts, I was very curious to know how they defined it. So I asked them. They gave me all kinds of definitions, very different from one another, but I brought them together, did a text analysis on it, and then I came to this one, this definition, which is a definition made by people who see themselves as introverted. So an introvert is someone who recharges by being alone. That does not mean that he or she doesn't want to be with other people, but if an introvert does that, he or she prefers smaller groups of people, and an introvert needs a little bit more time to express thoughts and to analyze things than an extrovert does, because what happens there is that an introvert first thinks from different perspectives and then starts talking when he or she feels that enough thinking has been done, right? Whereas for an extrovert, they think and speak at the same time. So it's a different preference. So that's why I added that one too. Then another thing to mention, since I see that a lot of people, people like to put themselves into boxes, right? With the letters and the colors and everything. But actually, there's a big gray area in this story, because personality is, well, normally distributed, as you see here. So most people, 68%, are in the middle. And that is what we call ambiverts. And ambiverts, they can stretch, they can be a little bit more introverted at one time, and the other time they're more extroverted. So most people are somewhere in the middle, because there are several genes responsible for personality, which causes them to end up somewhere in the middle most of the time. So we speak of introverts and extroverts only when we're talking about the extremes of the spectrum that you see on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So there's a big gray area. Any questions so far? Or any comments? Because I cannot see them when I'm screen sharing.
At the moment, I don't see any comments.
Okay.
So
Then I will just
move on.
Yeah, I will just move on then. linking that topic of personality to leadership, because in the end, that was what I was curious about, right? How is introversion linked to leadership? So I also read a lot of different papers on leadership, because there too, I think there are like numerous definitions of it. But I chose this one from 3 American scientists, Hogan, Curvey, and Hogan, and they describe it as persuasion instead of dominance. And according to them, it only works if people are willing to accept group goals for a certain period of time instead of their own goals. This is the one that I used. And then what I found is that there is a difference between who we see as leaders and who is actually effective as a leader. If we're looking at who we see as leaders, so the implicit leadership theory, well, then you see all of the different aspects here. So intelligence is important, honesty, sociability, understanding of other people, being assertive, being able to to speak well, right? The verbal abilities, determination, ambition. So there's a lot of energy in there as well. But this is just about who we see as leadership material, right? And it's a bit all over the place if you put that onto the big 5, like 4 out of 5, you can see it. So yes, indeed, extroversion is important because assertiveness and sociability, they're usually more linked to being more on the extroverted side. But then there's leadership effectiveness too, right? Which is a different thing. And that is very situation dependent. Because in the early days of leadership research, people thought that there was such a thing as a born leader or certain characteristics which would make you a leader. But here too, like almost anything in psychology I've learned now, is that it is nature and nurture. So yes, you need certain characteristics, but it's also dependent on the environment you're in as a leader. So it's very situation dependent. What they did find is that altruism, whether or not you are capable of dealing with other people, is actually the most important predictor of transformational or social leadership, which is seen as like one of the preferred kinds of leadership in these days. And then if we look at introverted leadership, then that is very well suited for self-managing teams, or where servant leadership, like the leading from behind kind of leadership, is needed. Why is that? Well, because introverted leaders, they tend to give a lot of space to other people. And if we're talking about a self-managing team, well, you need to give a lot of space, a lot of autonomy. That's why that works really well. Now, what are the differences between these types of leadership? Generally speaking, right? Because this is a generalization. It's not to say that it cannot be the other way around, but in general, what we do find is that people who are more on the extroverted side of the leadership spectrum, they tend to be a little bit more goal-oriented. They like to go fast, reach their goals fast. They like to do a lot of different things at the same time, talk to several people at the same time. So the breadth is something that they prefer. And because of the way they go about interacting with other people, they are seen as very charismatic as well. Then if we look at introverted leadership, it's a different kind of leadership. There's no right or wrong, I would say. It's just a different kind. Usually it's more human-centric and even more one-on-one. Introverts prefer one-on-one interactions instead of interacting with big groups. Introverts like to go deeper. Well, they don't mind being alone because of the way their brain works, which makes it easier for them to take a step back, take a helicopter view, become a little bit more analytical. And that also helps with doing more of the long-term strategy, for example, where you need to take a step back, where you need to take a little bit more time instead of going fast. So if you look at these two, then I always say that they are like a great combination because they have different strengths and they can help each other in a leadership role. And that's not something that happens a lot, but I think it would be a very wise thing to do for a lot of companies to actually combine the two because they have their own strengths, both of them. Well, then a short note on culture differences as well. I used to study languages, so that's also what made me very interested in these differences. Also, reading all of the already existing books on leadership and introverted leadership, I found them to be written in a very Western way. I missed like a different perspective on that. So that's why I added the culture dimension. And they're also going through some research into leadership and different cultures. I found that Asia and Africa tend to be a little bit more introverted, which has to do with the Hofstede dimension of collectivism. Well, some countries in these continents, they are still a little bit more collectivistic. It's more about doing something for the whole group, and that is linked to introversion because it's about giving the other person space. That's why they do that. Whereas Europe and Northern America, they are seen as more extroverted because there it's a little bit more individualistic, which is linked to extroversion, taking up space, showing your success. It's a different way of doing things. And then, of course, there's also such a thing as company culture. If you look at what is asked from you in different company cultures, well, that asks for different characteristics. And if we're talking about taking up space, taking the stage, showing what you have in store, then, for example, sales consultancy, they link to that very well. And that is why oftentimes people consider that to be a little bit more suited for people who are more on the extroverted side of the spectrum. I already mentioned the human-centric side of introversion, and that is what links it very well to the more human-centric sectors in the field, like healthcare, education, but also, for example, IT, where sometimes you need to solve a problem on your own, take some time for that. You see quite some introverts there as well. Then when I was going through all of that research, I also mentioned the brain research, right? And that is why I want to now link that to neurodiversity, which is an upcoming topic in the field of diversity, because it is a deeper layer of diversity. It's a layer that you cannot directly see, because neurodiversity is diversity based on differences in brain functioning. And as I mentioned, well, the brain of a person who is more on the introverted side works slightly different from someone who's on the other side of the personality spectrum. And what you do see happening in a lot of companies is this. Not only from the outside, because that one is obvious, right? Those three men are hiring someone who is just like them, who looks just like them. But what happens a lot is that they also hire a person with the same personality. I did that for like several companies to have them do a big 5 test of leadership of a company. And what you do discover is that they are quite similar, even on the surface, right? The deeper layers, so, which is only natural. That is called affinity bias. That as human beings, we prefer to be surrounded by people who are just like us because it feels safe. We know what we can expect. But you do miss out on a lot because look at the advantages of neurodiversity. If you do take these differences into account and if you do open up to people who are a little bit different from you, there's a lot of things that you can actually win from that. Like you can become more innovative because you have more people who have different opinions or different viewpoints, which can help you get better at problem solving as well. You can actually use all of your potential because if you stop looking through lens that only focuses on certain things instead of looking at the wide spectrum out there, well, then you can actually use all of that if you stop doing that. Also for recruitment, it gets easier because instead of focusing on just these candidates who are just like you can look further, you can find different people, maybe more people. And then there's less turnover because people can show up as themselves in the workplace, which is always good for psychological safety, for feeling accepted and then giving your best, right? When you're working. So all of that, I turned that into a thesis, obviously, but also into a book. And I want to share the main takeaways of all of that, not just for my research, but in general, because what a lot of people don't realize is that introversion is actually a strength, not a weakness. I even find introverts who don't want to be introverted, but if you start looking at the strengths of it, then it gives you a whole different perspective on it. And also, introverted leadership is just as valuable as other types of leadership. It's just a different kind. There's no wrong or right, just different. And also, adding personality to neurodiversity can lead to competitive advantages. You just saw some of them. In the end, I think it will also help people feel more accepted, feel that they can show up as themselves, which then in the end will lead to, well, happier people. And yeah, I think overall a better culture in the workplace, right? So that was everything that I wanted to share with you today. Feel free to ask any questions you may have.